Tim, let me maybe get you started here. Why does messaging typically go wrong? What do we do that is a bad idea?
Lots of things. By the way, if you want to see me full screen, which you will want to in a moment, because I'm going to use this light board technology, just go to the very upper right on your view of me, and there'll be a 3-dot menu. Just grab that and hit pin, and then that should pin me to full screen. So that's a very interesting question. Most organizations, large or small, would tend to have solutions that they think are pretty good. In fact, if you ask people, on a 1 to 10 scale, how good are your solutions, they'll give you a number of 8 or 9 out of 10. I'm sure most of you would agree with that you've got pretty good solutions. But when you ask them, how good do you think your messaging is, you get in front of your customer or your audience, you ask them how good their messaging is on the same scale, that number falls to below 4, about a 3.9 out of 10. So there's a real interesting gap between quality of your solution and the quality of your messaging around the solution. And by the way, the more technical the space, so we work with companies like Cisco Systems and IBM, Kyndryl, as they now are. The more technical the space, the wider that gap gets. And when you look superficially at most messaging, what you tend to see is PowerPoint-driven narratives. I use narratives in the loosest sense of the word because there's no narrative here. A whole bunch of slides. Now, PowerPoint is toxic. You want to be super careful about using it because it's going to seduce you into doing some really, really dumb things. But the fundamental problem is not PowerPoint. It's what we put in these PowerPoint decks. Think of PowerPoint as a vehicle in which stupidity drives around, but it's not fundamentally a problem with the vehicle. Typically, I'd summarize by saying there are 3 things most people get wrong with their messaging, and they manage to get all 3 things wrong simultaneously. The first is TMI. We pack way too much in. What's interesting about this, you see this in the sales messaging, this actually is a technology company. This is a 60-slide deck. And most of these slides, you can't see these, but most of these slides could of themselves be the topic of a full day. And yet they just cram more and more and more in. Now, the funny thing about this one is our motives are good. We don't actually set out to piss off and annoy our audiences. Our motives are actually good, at least I hope they are. We want to be thorough, we want to be complete, these solutions are technical, there's a lot to say, I want to deal with all the issues in the room, blah, blah, blah. What we don't realize, in fact, is we are creating true cognitive overload. I mean, any of you know the brain science of this. You don't have to get too far into a 60-slide deck before people have totally switched off. So TMI is a real problem. All right? If you've got 50 or 40 or even 30 slides, the audience customers switched off after 5, you've lost. Doesn't matter what else you do. The second problem with most messaging is what you're trying to say, the value you are trying to communicate of your solution, your model, your business, whatever it is usually just confusing. It's just unclear. The customer's like, I'm not really getting it. And there's all kinds of reasons why this happens. One, because you're already packing too much in. So to my point earlier, if someone switches off, they're never going to get what you're talking about. The second thing is we tend to get far too technical too quickly. We grossly overestimate the technical fluency of our audience. We forget that they don't live in the world we live in. We've done a ton of messaging for companies offering a direct care model, and they go out to employers, and the employer's lost within a few seconds because they just don't understand once you pull the hood up on the terrain of healthcare and the direct care model, what isn't technical to you is highly technical to that person who's maybe a CEO or a CHRO. They're not in the medical space. And then the third reason why most messaging is completely and thoroughly confusing is it lacks a logical narrative flow. We may or may not have time to get into this, but the brain requires a logical narrative to make sense of anything. The best example is if you read a book, makes total sense, right? Chapter 4 makes sense because of the context created by chapter 3, but read a book out of sequence won't make any sense, but it's the same content, but there's no flow creating context. And what you're going to see in almost all of your messaging is the individual slides tend to be an individual topic, but there's really no narrative stitching them all together. There might be a sort of vague narrative in your head, but it's very unclear. There's very few decks or presentations I review where I see a clear enough narrative.
Well,
So there's
Tim,
three different
let me just
reasons.
ask you, Tim, these healthcare folks, is there any place for a slide deck? Should they, other than for an investment, use that? Should we get away from PowerPoint? Are we better off just talking?
Yes. Sorry, no and no. No, there's no place for slide deck driven narratives. No place at all. I don't think PowerPoint enhanced the world of communication. PowerPoint was designed by a guy at Microsoft who was given the specific task of replacing overhead projectors. And the world took it and turned it into chronic laziness and stupidity. But you need to let me get to the end before that will all make sense, because I can't just pull the PowerPoint stool away without showing you what to do in its place, which is why I added a second no. You can't just talk. And there's a really, really important reason for that. So no, PowerPoint's not your friend. You shouldn't be using it. That's not quite true. You use it for a particular purpose, which is actually the delivery of a visual image. But you can't just talk. And there's actually an alternative solution to it, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Let me finish on this. The third problem that almost all of us encounter, or actually that's too passive, the mistake that we make is we are far too sender oriented. It's a facet of human nature that we see the world through our own lens. If you look at a group photo, all you do is look at yourself. If you're good, you declare the photo as being good. We have great difficulty viewing the world through someone else's eyes. And again, if I look at a deck like this, and I could grab any number of these decks, every single slide is about who we are, what we do, where we came from, our mission, vision, and values, our history, pictures of buildings, how our solution works. And the customer's like, why the hell do I care? Well done. You seem to be a very impressive company. We do a very, very poor job of orienting our communication towards our audience. And so we just tend to create this real disconnection. So there are a lot of different mistakes we make, but I would argue these are the primary ones, and they almost all show up simultaneously. And again, I could grab any one of hundreds of decks, and I'm going to find all of these three things almost always. And I want to come back to the slide question, but when you embed it in slide, it just makes it even worse.
Tim, one of the challenges that this group has is marketing to bigger hospital systems or systems.
Yeah.
And we grew up doing relationship management, and we're pretty good at it. But we're frustrated because we're not getting up to bat. We, like you said, we have wonderful solutions. We just are not very good at explaining those or getting to people. I'd like you to, get around to your thoughts about emails and all that.
Yeah.
But we're frustrated because in this consolidating world, the hospitals are bigger, they're more complicated, they're consolidated, and we're not being invited into the committee that decides where to buy our processes or not. You're going to get to
that. That is very definitely a consequence of this problem. By the way, this problem is going to show up even in emails you write. I open emails up. They're too long, so they fail the eyeball test. I'm not going to read that. They almost always start with, hey, let me tell you how cool we are. 90% of emails, 99% of emails go in the trash. Very important rules of how you write and construct emails. I mean, that's key, right? That's the consequence. When you do this, you're going to have three really negative consequences. One, to your point there, Jim, is you want your messaging to be compelling. When you engage somebody, you want them to leave saying, wow, those folks are really interesting. We need to talk again. And you just don't get that. You don't get that a lot of the time with messaging like this. You can win, but you don't win as often as you should. The second thing, which will not be as important for smaller organizations, but it gets important very quickly, is you're going to see a very high level of variability in how the story is being told. Some of you are smaller companies. You might only have 3, 4, 5 salespeople. But that means you've got 5 versions of your story. Nobody's on the same message. They all tell their story their own way. And typically what happens is 1 or 2 of them, particularly the founders, are really good at telling the story, but the rest of them are kind of, it's choose your own adventure. Now, 5,000 salespeople, like at Microsoft or Cisco, you've got a real problem. The majority of people aren't telling the story well. You've got to figure out the right message and get everyone essentially on message. This will show up, as I said, as a more important problem when, excuse me, when you get a few more salespeople. The real issue, though, and this is probably one of the most important things I want you to take away today, if this is all you take away, I'll be super happy, is this kind of messaging approach, the way we do it, is completely failing what I would call the retellability test. And I'm going to actually argue today that the single most important word in communication or messaging, and especially sales messaging, is retellability. Now, what do I mean by that? This is you. And just for the sake of simplicity, you're having a one-on-one sales conversation with someone at a hospital or a health system or a medical group, whoever it is. And we'll call this person Brian. Now, is that meeting important? Yeah, of course it's important. And you want it to go well. But is that the most important meeting? No, not even close. Not even by a very wide margin, it's not. Why? Because Brian is never going to be the sole decision maker. Even if they're the CEO, they're never going to be the sole decision maker. The decision to do the thing you're asking them to do is never going to be taken there. Sometime later, there is another meeting, and it's a meeting you are not going to be invited to. And at that meeting, this is incredibly important in healthcare. When you all say that healthcare buying cycles are insanely long, yeah, maybe, but it's probably because you're screwing this up. Healthcare buying cycles can be shortened if you understand retellability, because here's the decision-making body at the hospital, where it's the operating committee, the management committee, the pharmacology committee, doesn't matter what it is. And this is where the decision gets made. And so if you view the world through this lens, the important conversation isn't this one, it's Brian's ability to retell your story in that decision-making meeting. And this is what everybody fails to understand. We fixate on the first meeting, and we think because as long as that's gone well, then this will automatically go well. But that's absolute garbage. In fact, the problem of most messaging is it utterly fails the retellability test. Now, let me unpack this. This is unbelievably important. There are three huge implications of this. Number one, if your messaging is kind of weak here, if it displays some of these attributes, you can guarantee it's a disaster here. Why? Because of one very interesting aspect of communication, which is most people, especially most salespeople, have figured out, you all know how to do this, how to wrangle a crappy deck, how to navigate a crappy deck, whether this was given to you by marketing in a big company or just you didn't have enough time to put a good message together, can you throw together a slide deck? And the way you make it work is like, okay, 20 slides here, I haven't got time for that. I'll only present 5 of them, and I'll probably present slides 2, 3, 8, 7, and 21 to create the story I actually want to tell. Great, you can sort of wrangle the deck to make it work. Now, what do you do with Brian? You give Brian this deck. This is how it happens. It's his only takeaway from the meeting. He has no clue what you presented or what sequence you presented it, and there's no way he is going to put slides he hasn't even seen in front of this group and then essentially be forced to defend them. So we fool ourselves that it's going okay because we made this bad deck work, and it's not just dumping slides, it's explaining complex graphics or unpacking difficult ideas that the slide doesn't really capture. Brian has absolutely no chance of doing that. And by the way, people don't represent someone else's slide deck. It's just a fact of life. You're not going to fire up someone else's deck and represent it. I'll show you a better answer to that later. But this reality is why most sales messaging fails. Second implication of this is, as I mentioned, we tend to have a fixation on the first meeting. How many of you have come out of a sales conversation and either to yourself or someone else, you've said, oh, that went great, we've got this. And then 2 weeks later, you get the phone call like, oh crap, we don't got this, we don't have it. And that's the reason is we've over-rotated to the first meeting. What we have to be thinking about is second meeting success. Is my messaging so crisp, so clean, so compelling, so customer-centric, so easy to retell that in fact we can achieve second meeting success? You've got to reorient your focus away from the first meeting and onto the second. Your standard has to be messaging that can work here, delivered by Brian. Of course, if you get that, by definition, your first meeting success rate goes through the roof. which gets me to the third implication, which is colossal. Do you build messaging around your solution to persuade people? Hey, you should go with this direct care model. Hey, you should go with our healthcare practice. Hey, you should go with my solution. Of course you do. You all do. Do you build messaging, however, to equip? Not just to persuade Brian, but to equip Brian in this meeting? And the answer is no. I could ask 1,000 sales leaders, and I have, do you build messaging to persuade? Duh, yes. Do you build messaging to equip? No, I've never even thought about it. And if you look at this, you literally, and I don't have time to unpack this, from a cognitive standpoint, you couldn't build something that was less effective at equipping than something like this. There's an interesting concept in sales which has become unhelpful. It's the concept of the champion, right? Brian's the guy I've met with. I want Brian to be my champion. I want him to be motivated. In other words, I want to persuade him. But what good is an inarticulate champion? What if Brian is super excited, but has no ability to retell your story properly? What you need is an equipped champion or an articulate champion. So a lot of books in sales about, identify your customer champion or your advocate. That's correct, but it's only half true. The other half is that they've been properly equipped. So you have to redefine your approach to communication, in sales particularly, but through the lens of retailability. By the way, this isn't just sales. And if you work in a nonprofit and you're trying to raise money, this might be someone you've met. This is the grant distribution committee. You might be a CEO and you're going to do a leadership cascade of strategy. We have a specific product which we offer about how to do a leadership cascade of strategy. This is that mid-manager cascading to the lower level. By the way, I'm actually starting to work with a couple of attorneys, litigating attorneys. Retailability is the jury room, where the jury are discussing the closing argument, particularly of the lawyer. And this guy has applied our model. He is a prosecutor, essentially part of the FBI. And he says the number one thing after taking our full training is he's trying to build a retailability because the jury is going to go away and discuss the argument. And he's really onto something there. It's not that there's a single advocate. All of the jury will have heard the original argument, but the retailability and the way they discuss the argument later is everything. So there is really no communications context where this concept is not important. And that's the problem that's being created by what we do, which is why you've got to think really hard about how you do communication. And this, I think, is going to lay the foundation in a few minutes of why you've got to stay the hell away from PowerPoint.
Well, and you're talking about a champion. We all want those. I hope you get at some point to how do we find that champion? How do we get people to answer our emails? How do we make our website compelling? Because a lot of times, if that's our entry into these healthcare systems, we got to find the champion, someone that we can have that first meeting with.
Yeah, I mean, you don't find a champion, you earn one, right? You've got to create an argument that is compelling to this person and retellable. And whether you're going to do that through a keynote speech, a TED Talk, an email, a blog, a podcast, an outreach by phone, I don't really care. The key thing is your messaging has to be done right. And for it to be done right, it's going to actually have a new set of hallmarks. And if you get that right, then you're much more likely to be successful, whatever your entry point to the customer is, whether it's an initial kind of formal conversation or a quick WebEx, whatever it is. It all comes down to, you're not going to find an advocate. You're going to earn one. And you've got to do that by changing the way you communicate.
What are the things should we get into our heads, Tim, between now and then that will help us to have that conversation?
So the answer is you got to rethink the way you do messaging. And if you think the answer is I'm going to go from 30 slides to 20, you've completely misunderstood everything that I've said. What you actually need is messaging that aligns with the way the human brain consumes information. And there's an underlying premise here I don't have time to get into, which is over time, and particularly with the recent emergence of fMRI technology and similar technologies, we've started to understand better really how the brain processes information. And our model is simply about how do you align with the way the brain works. Because the fundamental problem with this isn't that it slides or that it's too dense. It just totally misaligns with how human beings learn. So what you want to get to, and let's take a couple of healthcare messages, is messaging that looks a lot more like this. These, funnily enough, are 2 physician burnout messages. One we built for J&J Medical Devices, one we built for a smaller company. And I'm going to show you a few examples. But good messaging is going to have 7 hallmarks. Now, I can only give you an overview of this today. If you want, it's not the purpose of today. We got some crazy cool training that are all the tools that allow you to build messaging this way. That's the fundamental thing we do. But at least these 7 give you a North Star to aim at. So what are the 7 hallmarks of getting it right? Number 1, really crisp and clean and simple. Let's take this example. This is some messaging we built with Cisco Systems for their WebEx platform. Used to be 100 slides of suicide-inducing numbness and boredom. It boils to this bifold. This is the guide that you would use, the conversation you'd use in the sales meeting. I'll come back to later why this is such a good format. But you can always boil an argument to just a couple of pages. In fact, we're working a lot with IBM at the moment. IBM have boiled their messages to 1 page. And that's a little dense, but it's still nothing like the hundreds of slides it used to be. Now, one thing I would say is, you may well say to me, yeah, Tim, that's not realistic. There's just so much stuff I have to cover. And I want to give you an unbelievably valuable tip here. Everybody, when they build a message, builds 1 document, 1 deck to rule them all. Why? Who said that's a rule? You always want 2. This is some healthcare messaging for a hospital lighting solution. This is the core conversation guide they would use in the sales meeting. Guess what? This is the appendix. This is all the other stuff you might need if the customer wants to go there. But at the moment you put it in here, it's going to contaminate and distract and dilute. By the way, a great rule of communication. Anything you put in front of your audience, you have given them permission to engage with. So if you're going down some rabbit hole you don't want to go down, but you caused it by putting something random on slide 53, which they found, it's your fault, not theirs. So you want to be super careful about blending what's primary and secondary. Primary document, secondary document. The paradox of communication is you tend to think you're going to be in this all the time. You're not. At this particular company, that appendix gets open barely 5% of the time. Second hallmark, this is unbelievably important. Deeply, profoundly rooted in the customer problem that you are going to solve. You've got to combat this sender orientation. You do not talk about yourself for at least the first third of the conversation. It's about the customer. It's about their issue and their problem. And this is an incredibly important discipline. So for example, look at the Cisco messaging. This is for a CIO. This is C-level messaging, very high level. What does it say on the front? It doesn't say introducing WebEx 4.0. It says, with so many tools to communicate, why do your global teams still feel so disconnected? Do you see how a CIO will lean into that question in the way they're not the least interested in learning about WebEx 4.0? And this particular format I love. You generally want this entire panel to be about the problem. It's bigger than you think it is. It's more serious than you think it is. It has more downstream consequences than you think it does. And a good working rule is you want at least a third of the conversation to be about the problem. Because if you don't set the anchor, it doesn't matter what you do. No one's interested. There's no such thing as a solution without a problem, but 90% of solutions messaging make no or only an oblique reference to a problem. It's actually bizarre. We do solutions, but there's no mention of a problem. It just grammatically, it doesn't make any sense. So you've got to have this incredible discipline to focus on the problem. By the way, this doesn't just create engagement. It gives you 2 other things. One, profoundly boosts credibility. Your credibility doesn't come from anything to do with you or your background or your history or how many people you have or how cool your building is. Your credibility flows directly from how well the customer perceives you understand them and their problem. So again, it's another pivot you have to make. The third thing focusing on the problem does is it destabilizes the customer's ability to do nothing. Customer's default is I don't want to do anything. I don't want to spend money I don't have, and I don't want a project I don't have time for. You've got to destabilize their desire to do nothing. And the only way you destabilize their ability or willingness to do nothing is by showing them they have a problem they can't afford to ignore. The third hallmark is you need to build your message around particularly your value proposition now, around a small number of big ideas. Ideas are the traffic of the mind. Data is not. If you get off this call and you happen to be discussing it with somebody and they said, hey, what was that workshop or what was that session you were in this morning? You're not going to play a recording of it from your mind. You don't have one of those. But what you probably would say is, oh, he talked about retellability, the idea that we need to build messaging that's functioning in the second and those subsequent meetings, because this is where sales happens. Do you see what you just did? Your brain took this content and boiled it to a small number of big ideas. So if that's true, which it is, wouldn't it make sense as a communicator to feed the brain exactly what it's looking for, which is a small number of big ideas? So go back to the Cisco message. If you were selling WebEx, you know the customer has a barrier, which is, well, we've already spent a bunch of money on Microsoft. Everyone uses Office and Teams is bundled in. So what, do we have to throw all that away? So what that does, and I'd have to show you the tool that gets a specific tool that helps you to derive ideas and insights from other data. It leads to this incredibly profound idea, which actually lives here, which is you don't have to throw Microsoft away. Great. Use them for what they're good for, but use us for what we're good for. So you build your narrative around a small number of big ideas. Again, this is a physician burnout message for J&J. You'll see exactly the same thing. You know, the key ideas around physician burnout and then physician engagement. The fourth hallmark is super interesting. As Westerners, which most of us are, we've been trained to be thoroughly rationalist. We always make a rational argument. You know, if I can prove my argument rationally, I'll win. That's dumb, because even the most superficial look at cognitive psychology tells us that human beings make decisions in the emotional senses of their brain. So we're trying to create a sort of, essentially what we're trying to do is create a right brain outcome with left brain tools. I wish I could get into this some more, but it's interesting. What you've got to do then is you've got to make your ideas sticky and memorable. And the way you do that is just rebalance towards emotional engagement rather than simply rational engagement. Now, let me illustrate that one for you. Imagine I had an idea. Okay, here's my idea that in Great Britain, the loss of life in World War I was absolutely terrible. So that's the idea I'm trying to land. I could do it this way, and I could say, you know what, in World War I, we lost 888,246 guys. That is a factually correct statement. Does that grip you in any way? No. And that slide's only been gone for 5 seconds, and probably none of you can even remember the number, because we don't do well with that. What if I took the same idea and I presented it to you this way? And the gentleman from the UK might have been aware of this. There was actually a piece of art developed in London for the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I. And he wanted to get that big idea across. And so what he did is he got 888,246 ceramic poppies, and he arranged them as sort of a cascade and sea of blood around the Tower of London. And what was interesting about this is two things. One is it was only meant to be there for a few weeks. They had to leave it there for months because people were just flocking to it. But more importantly, people were emotionally overwhelmed by this. They were absolutely moved. They were in tears. It was such a moving exhibit. And the key word you want to grab here is the word visualization. What you need to do in your messaging is take your most critical idea, or maybe two ideas here, and design a way to have your customer or audience visualize them. Now, you do this through story, imagery, metaphor, artifact. There are 4 or 5 tools that you use, but you've got to unshackle yourself from pure Western rationalism. 5th hallmark, very quickly, is this is the content of your message. It must be logically sequenced. Brain does terribly badly with unorganized information. You want to prove that? I want you to do something for me. Next time you're in any presentation, might be today, don't know when, and someone's just walking through slides, I want you to do this. I really mean it. They'll present a slide, and then they'll go to the next slide. I want you momentarily to pause and see if you can remember what was on that previous slide. And you're going to be shocked that you can't, because the brain cannot store information that's randomly assembled. Now, what's the good news? All of us, all of you, have a logical sequence staring you in the face. Just don't screw it up, because every sales message, in fact, every message will follow, it's sort of like a 3-movement symphony. I'll write that in there, PSA. Movement 1, let's take this physician burnout message. I love this. We've created a healthcare system that takes the world's most resilient people and burns them out. So then the problem is discussed here. Movement 1. What's the natural question in the customer's mind? Yeah, there's a problem. You know, we've had a lot of physician and nursing burnout. We've had a couple of suicides. We have a lot of people quitting. Can you solve this? Yes. Movement 2. We have an absolutely superior solution to this problem. It can be solved and we can solve it. So movement 2 is our solution. So then the customer's natural question is, okay, how do we move forward? How does it work? Movement 3, action. Problem, solution, action. I don't want to be overly legalistic, but that is an incredibly strong narrative structure, and it flows with the way the customer would naturally lean into that argument. So you've got the structure, just don't blow it. 6th hallmark, quickly, make sure the action is in fact clearly stated. It's too easy with sales conversations to end on a vague note. You know, the customer, you never want to say, oh, you know what, this was great, thanks for meeting with me, let's keep talking. No, what you want to say is, hey, if this was useful to you, this conversation, well, then let's do this as our next step. Let us come to your hospital and we'll do an audit. Let's say if you're a direct care model, we'll come and do an audit of your current plan. We'll tell you where it's weak, where it's strong, it won't cost you anything, and we'll see where we go from there. Now, I'll stop in 1 minute. Those are the 6 hallmarks of the message, but I said 7. The 7th hallmark is the document in which the message resides. And that document is specifically built for retailability. By the way, I didn't mention this, but we emailed you a handout. I didn't know exactly how the conversation would go today, but the handout basically contains what I'm saying. If you wanted to represent this to your team, you can't do it from memory, but you could absolutely do it from that document. See, here's the key reason, and Jim, this is now the answer to the question of why you can't just talk. The reason is, in human beings, unaided recall will never exceed 10%. And by the way, no 2 people remember the same 10%. So unaided recall is completely useless for you here in the retailability moment. Brian's going to remember 10% of what you said, and you've no idea what 10%. So you can't win the unaided recall battle. So don't even bother fighting it. You've got to provide aided recall. But here's the kicker. You can't give them a PowerPoint deck, because it's a horrible document, even the best PowerPoint deck. By the way, if you do use a PowerPoint deck for your document, great. 5 slides only. No presentation should exceed 5 slides. Title slide, then problem, insight, 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 action. But I still wouldn't do that. I would build a document. You can't typically use a slide deck. So build a document specifically designed for retailability and embed your argument in it. So those are the hallmarks of getting messaging right. Guess what? An email, a prospect email, completely should follow this doctrine. A TED Talk. I did a TED Talk last year. It was the 7th most watched TED Talk in the world. I built it using this exact same model. Again, we don't have time There are tools that underpin all this. Where do your ideas come from? What are the key aspects of the customer problem? We've got tools that underpin all this, but at least as the outcome, that's what you want messaging to look like. By the way, 80% of success probably comes from getting the architecture of the message right. About 20% comes from the delivery of the message. I'm not talking about eye contact and body language. I don't want to get into that today. The main thing you want to get right in delivery, this is design. The main thing you want to get right in delivery, honestly, is linguistic precision. In other words, this message you built, it came out the way you meant it to come out, which is actually to do with things like rehearsal. So you do not want to trust your mind that it's going to deliver this message the right way. It'll never do that without rehearsal. And the second thing you've got to get right is meeting management. If you're 1 minute in, the customer lobs a grenade and you're off in the briar patch, you may never get it back. So managing the conversation, using questions while managing the conversation is one of the two big pillars of delivery. The other one is linguistic precision and rehearsal. That's a whole other training, and there's design and delivery, so we won't really get into that. But anyway, that's kind of the answer. Do this, and you're going to solve this problem. One of the Cisco message I just told you about, it used to have a 35% conversion rate, which is very good with CIOs. That is now verified, tracking at 73% conversion rate. This particular message used to run about a 13% sales conversion rate and about a 12 to 24 month cycle time, hospitals long cycle times. After fixing the messaging, 34% conversion rate. And the cycle time selling to hospitals went to 6 to 12 months, from 12 to 24, and about 3 meetings instead of 6. Why? Because it was so much more retellable. The virus of the message was able to spread without you just having to come back interminably and do more meetings. So that's the answer. That's how you fix it.